Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Madeleine Muller, and welcome to this Clinical Supervisor Emotional Competence Skill Building Program. I'm going to be looking specifically at how we can build emotional competence through a series of little exercises that one can do. And this little tutorial is actually just the introduction on understanding what I mean by emotional competence. And you will see this work is very much grounded in behavioral science and understanding the neurophysiology of emotion and its effect on behavior. And we're drawing heavily on the work of Jack Panksepp and effective neuroscience. So it's helpful to understand that all human beings every single day are operating usually in two different physiological modes. And there's, of course, a whole range, but there's always these two possibilities depending on which part of your brain is in charge. So shared very much with the animal kingdom, if our survival mode is in charge, so that part that's responsible for our survival, very much led by our limbic brain and the surrounding amygdala, brainstem, and our whole endocrine system, then we are operating primarily through very specific instincts and drives. The opposite of that is when we are calm and relaxed, and our executive mode can then take the lead. This is our prefrontal cortex, our frontal lobes in conjunction with the rest of our brain. And then this gives us very much a different possibility and perspectives. So for example, if you're in survival mode, then of course your fight, freeze, fawn, flight system is going to be in predominance. So whenever you are under threat, but also we have very particular drives to help us, survive until we've reproduced, which includes our need for food, safety, sex and intimacy, tribe, and power. And when we're on survival mode, it changes our whole physiology and also our emotions to be able to achieve this safety or survival of the species. So this kind of focus when you are in that kind of a mode is very vigilant for any possible threat. It's very narrowly focused on the present moment. We're very self-centered at that point. And there's very particular negative emotions that come into drive that is actually biological impulses to try and get us to do something. And that includes fear, rage, and distress. And these then lead to destructive behaviors. We will look more at those in the exercises and can include behaviors like emotive judgment, becoming critical, being arrogant, being intolerant, being paranoid, being inflexible. These are all qualities of our survival brain. And in its most extreme form, if somebody is aggressive and actually dangerous to themselves or to somebody else, that's usually the survival mode that is in predominance, not the brightest part of ourselves. We're quite stupid at this part of ourselves. And I also like to describe it as your worst self. So whenever you have behaved in a way that's made you feel slightly embarrassed afterwards, you can be sure that this was your survival mode that was in predominance. But as human beings, we do not only have a survival mode, we have this prefrontal cortex. And this gives us the capability, it gives us possibilities to have these other capabilities that the animal kingdom, for example, does not have. So the prefrontal cortex makes it possible for us to plan. It gives us the possibility of empathy, stepping into somebody else's shoes. It gives us the ability to reflect on ourselves and on others and on things that's happened. And it gives us the possibility to actually control these impulses coming from our survival brain. So, in conjunction with the rest of our brain, this enables rational, higher order thinking and makes it possible for us to have perspective and be able to see the bigger picture of what's going on. So there's very particular positive emotions that can come into play when we are in executive mode, including care, seek, and play. We will look at that in more detail. And then the qualities that can arise when you are within this mode are qualities such as agency, reliability, humility, being tolerant, generosity, being compassionate, being creative, and being flexible. And when you're at your most supportive and your loving best self, then you can be sure that this is the mode that is in predominance. And this is also where we can be at our most intelligent. If you want to actually solve any difficult problems, you want to do something innovative and new and extraordinary. And you can think of this as your best self is able to step forward when you are in executive mode. So I like to use the analogy of your survival mode being like this very beautiful, powerful, but quite stupid dragon. And your executive mode is like a dragon master that's supposed to keep this dragon under control and decide where actually you want to be going in your life. So the emotions, so we're going to look at how emotions then link to behavior. And we now understand that emotions is very much part of our survival brain, and they're actually biological impulses to make us do something. So when our survival brain is in predominance, then we have predominantly negative emotions such as fear, which is an impulse to move away from something that's threatening us. There's rage, which is the biological impulse to destroy an obstacle in your way. And then is distress, which is the biological impulse to cry out. And you can imagine in a small animal or a small child who has lost their caregiver will have this extraordinary feeling of pain when they are abandoned, and that pain will make them cry out. So it's literally the body creates an experience of extreme pain. And one experiences this whenever you feel loss or abandonment, when everyone goes through a bereavement, through a breakup, for example, but also when everyone feels rejected or isolated in some ways. And of course, if you are stuck within this state, within, for example, such as depression might do, this has got a very high risk of suicide because of this extraordinary pain that this emotion creates. There's also positive emotions, and positive emotions are also created by our survival system. But when we do not have adrenaline in our system, it actually becomes possible for us to extend these positive emotions to serve our higher self and our prefrontal cortex. So this includes our positive emotions such as care, which is the biological impulse to give and or receive care. So when you're nurturing somebody else or when somebody else is nurturing you, this is, of course, when we talk about love, very much linked to attachment and oxytocin. And that can include looking after your children, your parents, or a loving other. Play is our biological impulse to enjoy something, to do an activity for its own sake. So all, small animals also play, and that helps them to build their own little tribes and their own particular skills within that tribe. And as human beings, here lies our abilities to do art, all our hobbies, all our culture, and all of our amazing things we do together as human beings, sport and games, and where we are able to simply enjoy an activity for its own sake. I really love this biological emotion of seek, which is also in the animal kingdom. You'll imagine a cat in a new room would go and explore and touch and sniff everything. And similarly, as human beings, we have this biological impulse to explore and figure things out and find things out. This particular emotion is very strongly related also to our frontal lobes. It sort of gets extended within our cognitive system. And so whenever you're involved, when you are learning something or when you're involved with a scientific endeavor or when you're solving a problem or when you're figuring something out, and you're doing it in a way that's making you feel excited and curious, then you are within a positive emotion of seek. And this is predominant in the executive mode. And as I've said, the negative emotions predominant when we are in survival mode. So let's see how this all then links up. So these emotion to behavior is very useful when we're under physical threat. So that was sort of the original design. So something happens, for example, a dog runs towards you barking. I like to go running on the beach, so this happens every now and then. You have an emotion that gets triggered by your fight-flight system. So it might be fear, the biological impulse to move away. And you're going to feel very strongly that you have to behave. So either fight this dog or run away or freeze or whatever it might be. And you can see this is actually quite sensible when you're dealing with physical threat. But saboteurs is the term that we use when we use these behaviors in relationships. And Shazar Chamin has beautifully described these different saboteurs. So, for example, you have an argument with your partner, it links, you feel a little bit unsafe. So you have this trigger of your survival system and you go into either fear, rage, or grief. This emotion is very unpleasant. And there's a biological impulse that you have to manage this threat through your fight-flight system. So now this goes into behavior, and these are very complex behavior patterns that we've already created as children to try and help us cope with these difficult emotions. So you might end up criticizing your partner, or you avoid your partner, or you do a long lecture to your partner. And the reason why Chamin calls these patterns saboteurs is because generally in a relationship setting, these automatic behaviors just make things worse. So I want to now let us think a little bit in terms of education, and especially education of doctors. And we quite often talk about higher order skills. So how do we teach doctors to be compassionate, to be humble, to be reliable? And so I'm making an argument here for us to think of this from this paradigm of emotional competence. So as I've outlined, if people are behaving in a way that's destructive or unhelpful or making a situation worse, this is actually to do with them being in survival mode, having this strong emotion that's resulting in this counterproductive behavior. On the other hand, when people are at their best, when they are being honest and reliable and kind and helpful and tolerant and things generally gets better, then you can be sure that they're actually in their executive mode. They're able to generate positive emotions, and that can now result in these innovative, constructive, and creative behaviors. So when we talk about how we teach somebody to be a better person, right? We want them to be more compassionate. We want them to be more reliable. We want them to be more humble. Perhaps we don't have to teach these qualities in terms of, making a whole long argument of why it's good to be kind. Maybe all we need to do is actually teach them how to manage their own inner dragons. Because once you've managed your emotions and are able to understand and get on top of your counterproductive behaviors, this then makes it possible for you to actually access your prefrontal cortex and have access to these potential higher order skills. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about emotional competence. So, emotional competence is a newer term than emotional intelligence. I like it because it's looking at emotional regulation as a skill. And there are three levels one can identify towards becoming an emotional competent adult. The first is emotional insight. So, having an understanding how emotions drive your behavior. And this is basically what we're going to be doing in the first couple of exercises. Then being able to build emotional awareness. So this is actually a skill of being able to recognize these subconscious distressing emotions in real time as they arise. And then lastly, emotional competence is now actually being able to modify that behavior that's being driven by emotion and potentially getting you back again to a calm state in which you can access your higher order skills. So the 7 exercises is going to take us and touch on all three of these different levels, and are all things you can incorporate in your everyday life to achieve better emotional competence and to live your life more according to your higher values rather than the impulses of your survival system. Thank you.